As Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria in August 1945, Ishii and his subordinates realized that Unit 731 would soon be overrun. Rather than surrender or attempt to preserve their research for potential war crimes trials, they began a systematic campaign to destroy all evidence of their activities. The destruction was methodical and thorough. Laboratory equipment was dismantled or destroyed, research records were burned, and the facility's buildings were demolished. Most critically, all remaining prisoners were murdered to prevent them from testifying about what they had experienced. This final act of Unit 731, the murder of witnesses to prevent accountability, revealed the true nature of the organization. The researchers knew that what they had been doing was criminal, and they were willing to commit additional murders to avoid prosecution for their crimes. The cover-up extended beyond the physical destruction of evidence. Unit 731 personnel were instructed to never speak about their activities, and to deny any knowledge of biological weapons research if questioned by Allied authorities. Many were given new identities and assignments that would make it difficult for investigators to track them down. Soviet forces who reached the Unit 731 site found only rubble and ashes. The massive complex that had housed thousands of personnel and conducted experiments on an industrial scale had been reduced to ruins. The evidence of what had happened there seemed to have been eliminated completely. But Ishii had miscalculated. Some evidence survived the destruction, some witnesses escaped the final massacre, and most importantly, some perpetrators would eventually be captured and forced to testify about their activities. The American cover-up. Perhaps the most morally troubling aspect of the Unit 731 story is what happened after the war ended. When American occupation forces learned about the biological weapons program, they faced a choice between pursuing justice for the victims and obtaining valuable intelligence data. They chose the data. Under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, American authorities entered into secret negotiations with Ishii and other Unit 731 leaders. In exchange for detailed information about their biological weapons research, the Americans agreed to grant immunity from war crimes prosecution to key Unit 731 personnel. This decision was driven by the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. American military leaders believed that the biological weapons data could provide a crucial advantage in any future conflict, and they were unwilling to risk losing that advantage by prosecuting the researchers who had developed it. Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, one of the American investigators who first interrogated Unit 731 personnel, later described the moral compromise involved. "We knew what these men had done, knew they were war criminals of the worst sort. But we also knew that they had developed biological weapons capabilities that could be crucial in a war with the Soviets." The decision was made at the highest levels of government. The data was more valuable than justice. The deal struck with Unit 731 personnel was kept secret for decades. Official reports claimed that no evidence of Japanese biological weapons programs had been found, and Ishii and his colleagues were quietly reintegrated into Japanese society. Many went on to successful careers in medicine, academia, and business, their crimes hidden from public view. This cover-up represented a fundamental betrayal of the victims of Unit 731. The people who had been tortured and murdered in the name of biological weapons research were denied justice so that their tormentors could provide information to their former enemies. Soviet justice limited scope. While the Americans were secretly negotiating with Unit 731 leaders, Soviet forces were pursuing their own investigation of Japanese biological weapons activities. Unlike the Americans, the Soviets were willing to prosecute some of the perpetrators, though their efforts were limited in scope. In 1949, the Soviet Union held the Khabarovsk war crimes trial, prosecuting 12 former Unit 731 personnel for their roles in biological weapons development, and human experimentation. The trial provided detailed testimony about Unit 731's activities and resulted in convictions and prison sentences for the defendants. The testimony given at the Khabarovsk trial provided some of the first detailed public accounts of Unit 731's activities. Former researchers testified about vivisection experiments, biological weapons testing, and the systematic murder of prisoners. The transcripts of their testimony became crucial historical documents that helped establish the scope and nature of Unit 731's crimes. However, the Khabarovsk trial was limited in its reach. Most Unit 731 personnel, including Ishi himself, were in American custody and were never extradited to face Soviet prosecution. The 12 men who were tried represented only a small fraction of the thousands of individuals who had participated in Unit 731's activities. Moreover, the Cold War context meant that the Soviet prosecution was viewed with suspicion by Western observers, who dismissed it as propaganda rather than legitimate pursuit of justice. This attitude contributed to the continued suppression of information about Unit 731 for decades after the war. Denial and gradual acknowledgement. For decades after World War II, the Japanese government officially denied that Unit 731 had ever existed. When confronted with evidence of biological weapons research, officials claimed that any such activities had been limited in scope and conducted without government authorization. This official denial was supported by the American cover-up, which had removed key evidence and witnesses from potential prosecution. Without access to classified American documents or surviving Unit 731 personnel willing to testify, researchers found it difficult to document the full scope of the program. The wall of silence began to crack in the 1980s when some former Unit 731 personnel began to speak publicly about their experiences. Dr. Ken Yuasa, who had participated in vivisection experiments, began giving lectures about Unit 731's activities, expressing remorse for his participation and calling for official acknowledgement of the crimes. Other veterans followed Yuasa's example, providing detailed accounts of specific experiments and atrocities. Their testimony, combined with declassified American documents and surviving physical evidence, gradually built an undeniable case for the existence and scope of Unit 731's biological weapons program. In 2002, the Tokyo District Court officially acknowledged that the Japanese military had conducted biological warfare experiments in China, though the ruling avoided assigning specific responsibility or ordering compensation for victims. This represented the first official Japanese acknowledgement of Unit 731's activities, though it fell far short of the full accounting that victims' families and human rights advocates demanded. The search for justice. The victims of Unit 731 and their families have spent decades seeking acknowledgement and compensation for the crimes committed against them. This effort has been complicated by the passage of time, the destruction of evidence, and the political sensitivities surrounding Japanese war crimes. Chinese survivors and family members have filed lawsuits in Japanese courts seeking compensation and official apologies. These cases have faced numerous legal obstacles, including statutes of limitations and sovereign immunity claims. While some courts have acknowledged that atrocities occurred, they have generally refused to order compensation. The search for justice has been hampered by the fact that most Unit 731 personnel are now deceased. Ishii died in 1959, having never faced prosecution for his crimes. Other key figures lived full lives in post-war Japan, protected by the immunity agreements they had negotiated with American authorities. Some former Unit 731 personnel did face consequences for their actions, though not through formal legal proceedings. Several committed suicide in the post-war period, apparently unable to live with the knowledge of what they had done. Others lived with psychological trauma that affected them for the rest of their lives. The quest for justice has also involved efforts to preserve historical memory and educate the public about Unit 731's crimes. Museums and memorial sites have been established in China to document the atrocities and honor the victims. Educational programs have been developed to ensure that younger generations learn about this dark chapter of history. Lessons for medical ethics. The Unit 731 case has become a crucial study in medical ethics, illustrating how easily the medical profession can be corrupted when it abandons its fundamental principles. The transformation of healers into killers at Unit 731 serves as a warning about the importance of maintaining ethical standards even under extreme pressure. Medical schools around the world now use the Unit 731 case as an example of how not to conduct research. The case illustrates the importance of informed consent, the protection of vulnerable populations, and the absolute prohibition on research that causes harm without prospect of benefit to the subject. The Nuremberg Code, developed in response to Nazi medical experiments, established fundamental principles for ethical human research that were directly applicable to the Unit 731 case. These principles include voluntary consent, avoidance of unnecessary suffering, and the right of subjects to terminate their participation at any time. However, Unit 731's crimes went far beyond unethical research. They constituted systematic torture and murder conducted under the guise of scientific investigation. The case demonstrates that ethical codes alone are insufficient to prevent atrocities if they are not backed by strong institutional safeguards and a culture of moral accountability. Modern medical research is governed by institutional review boards, informed consent procedures, and international oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of abuses that occurred at Unit 731. These safeguards are not perfect, but they represent important progress in protecting research subjects from exploitation and harm. The biological weapons legacy. Unit 731's biological weapons research contributed to the development of international agreements prohibiting the use of such weapons. The 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits the development, production, and stockpiling of biological agents for offensive purposes, was motivated in part by revelations about programs like Unit 731. However, the knowledge gained from Unit 731's experiments continued to influence biological weapons research during the Cold War. Both the United States and Soviet Union incorporated data from Japanese biological weapons programs into their own research, raising troubling questions about the continued exploitation of Unit 731's victims. The dual-use nature of biological research means that legitimate medical research can potentially be adapted for weapons purposes. This creates ongoing challenges for oversight and regulation, as the same techniques used to develop treatments for disease can also be used to create biological weapons. Modern biosecurity efforts must grapple with the legacy of programs like Unit 731, working to prevent the misuse of biological research while preserving the benefits of legitimate medical investigation. This requires constant vigilance and strong international cooperation to detect and prevent biological weapons development. Remembering the victims. As we confront the horror of Unit 731, it is crucial that we remember not just the atrocities that were committed, but the individual human beings who suffered and died. Behind every experiment, every injection of deadly bacteria, every vivisection without anesthesia was a person with hopes, dreams, family, and friends. The victims of Unit 731 came that would kill both them and their unborn children. Many of the victims were Chinese civilians who had committed no crime other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others were prisoners of war who should have been protected under international law. All were human beings who deserved to live their lives in dignity and peace. The families of Unit 731's victims have spent decades seeking acknowledgement of their loved ones' suffering and death. Many never learned what happened to family members who disappeared during the war, discovering only decades later that they had been murdered in medical experiments. These families deserve more than historical acknowledgement. They deserve justice, compensation, and assurance that such atrocities will never be repeated. Their persistence in seeking truth and accountability serves as an inspiration to all who believe in human dignity and the rule of law. Modern implications. The lessons of Unit 731 remain relevant today as medical research becomes increasingly sophisticated and powerful. Advances in genetics, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence create new possibilities for both healing and harm, requiring constant vigilance to ensure that research serves humanity rather than exploiting it. Recent revelations about unethical research conducted in various countries demonstrate that the temptation to prioritize scientific advancement over human welfare has not disappeared. From unauthorized human experiments to research conducted without proper consent, the medical profession continues to face challenges in maintaining ethical standards. The international community has established numerous safeguards designed to prevent the repetition of atrocities like those committed by Unit 731. These include international criminal courts, human rights monitoring systems, and professional codes of conduct for medical researchers. However, these safeguards are only as strong as the commitment of nations and individuals to uphold them. The Unit 731 case demonstrates that even educated, intelligent people can be induced to participate in systematic atrocities if appropriate checks and balances are not in place. The imperative of memory. Unit 731 represents one of the darkest chapters in human history, a systematic program of torture and murder conducted under the guise of scientific research. The victims of this program, over 3,000 individuals who were killed in experiments and hundreds of thousands more who died from biological weapons attacks, deserve to be remembered and honored. Their sacrifice was not voluntary, and their deaths served no legitimate scientific purpose. They were murdered to satisfy the cruel curiosity of researchers who had abandoned every principle of medical ethics and human decency. But their memory serves a crucial purpose in our modern world. By remembering what happened at Unit 731, we commit ourselves to ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated. We honor the victims by maintaining vigilance against those who would exploit vulnerable populations for personal or political gain. The story of Unit 731 is not just a historical curiosity, it is a warning about what happens when we abandon our commitment to human dignity and allow scientific research to proceed without ethical constraints. It reminds us that progress achieved through exploitation and murder is not progress at all, but regression into barbarism. As we remember the victims of Unit 731, we also remember our responsibility to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation, to maintain ethical standards in research, and to ensure that the medical profession serves humanity rather than harming it. The victims of Unit 731 cannot be brought back to life, and their suffering cannot be undone. But we can honor their memory by ensuring that their stories are told, that their suffering is acknowledged, and that such atrocities are never again committed in the name of science or national security. This has been World War II Stories. I'm Philip Champion. As we conclude this difficult but necessary examination of Unit 731, let us remember that the greatest tribute we can pay to its victims is to remain vigilant against any attempt to dehumanize and exploit our fellow human beings. The medical profession's commitment to first do no harm must never again be abandoned, and we must never forget the price paid by those who suffered and died when that commitment was betrayed. Their memory demands our vigilance, and their sacrifice calls us to be better than those who came before us. Welcome back, history enthusiasts. I'm Philip Champion, and this is World War II Stories. Today we're going to confront one of the darkest chapters in human history. A story so horrific, so fundamentally evil, that it challenges our understanding of what human beings are capable of when they abandon every principle of medical ethics and human decency. This is not a story of battlefield heroism or military strategy. This is a story of deliberate, systematic torture conducted under the guise of scientific research. It's a story that the world tried to forget for decades, that governments covered up for political expediency, and that only now, more than 75 years later, is being fully acknowledged and understood. Picture this. In the remote forests of Manchuria, behind the walls of a compound that locals were told was a lumber mill, thousands of innocent people, men, women, children, and pregnant mothers, were being subjected to medical experiments that violated every principle of human dignity. They were infected with deadly diseases, dissected while still alive, frozen and thawed like laboratory specimens, and subjected to tortures that had no scientific purpose beyond satisfying the sadistic curiosity of their captors. This is the story of Unit 731, Imperial Japan's biological warfare research program, where over 3,000 human beings were murdered in the name of science, and where the data from their suffering was later traded to the United States in exchange for immunity from war crimes prosecution. But this is also a story that must be told, not to sensationalize human suffering, but to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. The victims of Unit 731, Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, Korean laborers, and others, deserve to have their stories heard and their sacrifice remembered. As we explore this darkest chapter of World War II, we honor not the perpetrators but the victims, and we commit ourselves to ensuring that the medical profession never again abandons its fundamental principle: first, do no harm. The architect of horror. The man responsible for Unit 731 was Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but deeply disturbed physician who had become obsessed with the military potential of biological warfare. Born in 1892 to a wealthy landowner family, Ishii had shown early promise as a student, eventually graduating from Tokyo Imperial University's medical school with honors. But Ishii was not content with conventional medicine. He was fascinated by the potential of bacteria and viruses as weapons of war, and he believed that Japan could gain a decisive military advantage by mastering biological warfare. In the 1920s and early 1930s, he traveled extensively in Europe and America, studying bacteriology and observing the latest developments in medical research. What Ishii learned during his travels convinced him that Japan needed to develop its own biological weapons program. He argued that such weapons could be more effective than conventional artillery or bombing, capable of decimating enemy forces while leaving infrastructure intact. More chillingly, he argued that biological weapons could be used to target civilian populations, breaking enemy morale and forcing surrender. In 1932, Ishii established a small research facility in Harbin, Manchuria, where he began preliminary experiments on prisoners provided by the Japanese military. The results convinced his superiors that biological warfare deserved serious investment. In 1936, they authorized the construction of a massive new facility that would become known as Unit 731. The complex that Ishii built covered over 6 square kilometers and employed more than 3,000 personnel. To outside observers, it appeared to be a lumber mill or water purification plant. But behind its walls lay laboratories, dissection rooms, prison cells, crematoriums, and breeding facilities for the millions of fleas, rats, and other disease vectors that would be used in Ishii's experiments. Ishii ruled this kingdom of horror with absolute authority. He handpicked his staff from Japan's most prestigious medical schools, recruiting young doctors and researchers with promises of career advancement and scientific glory. Many of these men were idealistic medical students who believed they were contributing to important research that would benefit their country and advance medical knowledge. But Ishii had no interest in advancing legitimate medical knowledge. He was creating a factory for developing biological weapons, and the human beings who would serve as his test subjects were nothing more than laboratory equipment to be used and discarded. The victims. Logs in a killing machine. The prisoners who were brought to Unit 731 were stripped of their humanity from the moment they arrived. In the clinical language of their captors, they were not people. They were maruta, meaning logs in Japanese. This dehumanizing terminology was deliberate, designed to make it easier for researchers to conduct their experiments without psychological distress. The maruta came from many backgrounds and nationalities. Chinese civilians made up the largest group, men, women, and children who had been arrested on suspicion of being communists, resistance fighters, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Soviet prisoners of war, captured during border conflicts with the Soviet Union, formed another significant group. Korean laborers, Mongolian civilians, and even some Europeans were among the victims. What united all these people was their complete helplessness. They had been torn from their families and communities, transported to a remote location where no one would look for them, and delivered into the hands of men who saw them as nothing more than experimental material. The conditions in which the maruta were kept were designed to ensure their complete dehumanization. They were housed in small, windowless cells with no heating, minimal food, and no medical care for their existing injuries or illnesses. They were given numbers instead of names, and guards were instructed to never speak to them or acknowledge their humanity in any way. Many prisoners died before they could even be used in experiments, succumbing to the deliberately harsh conditions of their imprisonment. But for those who survived long enough to become experimental subjects, their ordeal was just beginning. The experiments conducted on these victims were not designed to advance medical knowledge or improve human welfare. They were designed to test the effectiveness of biological weapons, to understand how diseases progressed in human subjects, and to satisfy the sadistic curiosity of researchers who had abandoned every principle of medical ethics. The experiments. Science without conscience. What happened inside Unit 731's laboratories represents one of the most systematic violations of medical ethics in human history. The experiments conducted there were not driven by scientific curiosity or the desire to advance medical knowledge. They were designed to weaponize disease and to understand how effectively biological agents could kill and incapacitate human beings. Prisoners were deliberately infected with every disease the researchers could cultivate: plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, dysentery, and other deadly pathogens were injected into healthy individuals so that researchers could observe the progression of disease in real time. The victims received no treatment. The purpose was not to cure them, but to watch them die. Even more horrifically, many of these experiments involved vivisection, the dissection of living human beings without anesthesia. Researchers wanted to observe how diseases affected internal organs while the victims were still alive, believing that this would provide more accurate data than post-mortem examinations. Dr. Ken Yuasa, one of the few Unit 731 veterans to publicly confess his participation in these atrocities, later described the psychological pressure that led medical professionals to abandon their ethics. At first, it was difficult to accept what we were doing, but gradually you became used to it. The prisoners were no longer people to us. They were research material. We convinced ourselves that what we were doing was necessary for Japan's victory. Pregnant women were infected with diseases so that researchers could study how pathogens affected developing fetuses. Children were subjected to the same experiments as adults, with researchers showing particular interest in how young immune systems responded to biological agents. The facility also conducted extensive research on the effects of extreme cold, motivated by Japan's military campaigns in northern China and potential conflict with the Soviet Union. Prisoners were exposed to freezing temperatures until they developed severe frostbite, then subjected to various treatments to determine the most effective methods for both causing and treating cold weather injuries. Chemical weapons testing was another major area of research. Prisoners were exposed to various chemical agents to test their effectiveness as weapons and to develop protective measures for Japanese troops. Gas chambers were constructed where prisoners were killed with various chemical agents while researchers observed their death throes through observation windows. The breeding of death. Unit 731's biological weapons program required massive quantities of disease-carrying organisms. The facility included extensive breeding areas where researchers cultivated billions of bacteria, viruses, fleas, rats, and other vectors that could be used to spread disease among enemy populations. The scale of this operation was staggering. Unit 731 operated more than 4,500 special incubators for breeding fleas infected with bubonic plague. They maintained colonies of rats, mice, and other rodents that served as hosts for various diseases. They cultivated massive quantities of bacteria in laboratories that worked around the clock to produce biological agents. The goal was not just to develop biological weapons for use against military targets, but to create agents that could be used to attack civilian populations on a massive scale. Researchers developed methods for contaminating water supplies, agricultural products, and food distribution systems with deadly pathogens. Field testing of these weapons began as early as 1940, when Unit 731 aircraft dropped ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities. The results were devastating. Entire communities were decimated by disease outbreaks that authorities were powerless to stop or treat. The October 1940 attack on Ningbo resulted in a plague outbreak that killed over 1,500 people and rendered entire neighborhoods uninhabitable. Similar attacks on other Chinese cities produced comparable casualties, with the added horror that civilians had no idea they were being attacked with biological weapons. These field tests were not conducted in remote areas against military targets. They were deliberate attacks on civilian populations designed to test the effectiveness of biological weapons under real-world conditions. The victims were innocent men, women, and children whose only crime was living in areas under Japanese occupation. The psychology of evil. One of the most disturbing aspects of Unit 731 is how easily educated, intelligent people were induced to participate in systematic murder. The researchers were not sadistic criminals or mentally ill individuals. They were trained medical professionals who had taken oaths to preserve and protect human life. The transformation of healers into killers was achieved through a combination of ideological indoctrination, peer pressure, and gradual escalation. New arrivals at Unit 731 were initially assigned to relatively benign tasks, maintaining equipment, preparing laboratory materials, or observing experiments conducted by others. As they became accustomed to the environment, they were gradually given more direct roles in the experimental process. The psychological barrier to participating in atrocities was lowered incrementally, until activities that would have horrified them upon arrival seemed routine and normal.